what are constraints, why do we want to use them, and how can we use them to the best of their ability so we get just all the details we want in our animations simply and easily. So to kind of just start this off here, constraints are a way of connecting things in Maya. That's pretty much it. Now in Maya, there's a lot of different ways to connect things. We can merge objects together. We can combine objects together. We can connect objects. We can parent them and we can constrain them, among many other ways. As animators, which is predominantly what I am, I tend to animate most of the time. The two things that we will tend to do is parenting and constraining. Those are the two different ways we connect objects because they work in an animation level. Connecting and all of those other elements tend to work on more of a rigging level before we get our hands on it. So we will usually do parenting and constraining. Now, what's the difference? Parenting and constraining. Well, let's start off with parenting here. So I'm going to create two objects. Let's create a cube and let's create a cylinder right here, like so. Now I'm going to call this Bob and Steve. I don't know why those are my two go-to names for anything, especially Bob. Bob is always my go-to name. I don't know why. So we've got Bob and Steve here. And I want to connect these two together, have them interact with each other. Right now they are totally separate objects. And I can see this by going into the outliner. So you can see there, right there, two different objects totally disconnected. So the first way we can connect them as animators is what's called parenting. And parenting is a hierarchy connection. What that means is that we place one object into the hierarchy of the other, essentially putting it underneath the first object. So to do this, we'll put Steve here as the child, the one underneath. You'll select your child first, then your parent. So Steve, then Bob here. Go to Edit, Parent, right there. Boop, like so. And now you'll see that Steve is the child of Bob, like so. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because whenever you have a hierarchy like this, you're going to get influences that go across the hierarchy. So for example, now if I move Bob, Steve, the cylinder, will move as well. If I move the cylinder, it doesn't affect the box because it's only going to affect anything below it on the hierarchy. So now this can move on its own. Very nice, very quick, very easy. So that's essentially parenting, is just placing objects into the hierarchy of one another, which is very powerful, very quick, very easy. Now, with this, what does constraining do? Well, let's just do that super quickly, and then I'll go into a little bit more of a deeper dive. So constraining, what it does is it doesn't change the hierarchy, it adds a connection to the object. So with constraining, you select it in the opposite direction. I'll explain more about that in a little bit here. So I'm going to select the box here, then the cylinder. I'm going to go to constrain and then parent here. Oh, already this is very confusing. Why is there a parent, constraint, edit, parent? Are they the same thing? Just by name, yeah, they should be. They are not. It's very confusing when you first start out. A parent constraint is a constraint that acts like parenting. It isn't parenting, but it's just going to move in a similar way. That's why it's called that. So we'll do this super quick right here, just so you can see what happens. So if we look at the outliner, you'll notice that nothing's changed. The only thing we do get is a new node underneath the cylinder here, which is the parent constraint. And essentially what this node is doing is going, okay, Steve, the cylinder, you're going to follow the box. And that's all it does. And you can see that the attributes here turn blue, showing that those attributes are now connected to another object. So if I move the cube here, we now get that following action, all good. So that's really the difference between parenting and constraining. One is a hierarchy object or hierarchy operation. It places one object within another. The other is essentially just adding a new node, telling things, okay, now you're connected. Great. That's pretty simple on its own. But why would we use one over the other? What's the point? They both move objects the same way, it seems. Well, let me bring in a more complex scene right here. So this is just a plate on a table with some objects in it. So you see here we have a table, plate, a green ball, a bowl, and a red ball. Now, if I move the plate right now, nothing is connected. Okay, so we need to create a hierarchy over here. We need to either constrain these or we need to parent them. We need to connect these in some way. Let's do parenting first. So once again, parenting, the way you set this up is you select the child, then the parent. So you're going to select the thing that follows, then the thing that leads. The way you can remember this is a good parent always puts their child first. So when you're parenting, you select the child first, then the parent. So in this case, the green ball will follow the plate. I'm going to select these and hit P on the keyboard, P as in parent. You'll see it got placed into the hierarchy right there. Now I'm going to select the bowl, then the plate, hit P, red ball, then the bowl, hit P. So I've just created that hierarchy right in here. You can see right there. So the plate has the green ball and the bowl within its hierarchy, and then the red ball is within the bowl's hierarchy. Perfect, great. And with all of this, it all moves together. Yay, nice and simple. So parenting is great. It allows us to move things around. It allows us to connect things. It organizes the outliner for us. Beautiful. What are some of the other bonuses of it? Well, the biggest one as an animator is that you can animate a parenting operation. So if I move the plate here and then I need to go, this green ball here, it needs to roll around, maybe over here. The bowl needs to rotate a little bit as it spins. Okay, then I can move the plate over here and then I can animate the green ball, maybe moving a little bit over here, and maybe this starts rolling this way and the red ball rolls in there. I have freedom to animate this. The way it was explained to me when I was first learning constraints a long time ago is it's like a parent taking their child to the mall. The parent is walking to their line. They're just going shopping for food. They don't care about anything else. But as they're walking down the mall, the kid is following them, but they have the mind of their own. They are checking every window, looking at the toys, looking at the music, looking at the cool new clothes, and they're going to be moving with the parent, but doing their own thing. So they are connected in the way that the kid is not just going to run off and just do their own separate thing, completely different, but they are free to kind of wander around the parent. So that's how parenting works. Very nice, very quick and easy. Now, what are some of the negatives of parenting? Well, one of the more less understood ones is what we call double transformations. So double transformations is something that can happen when you have a hierarchy level setup. So here we have all these objects within a hierarchy and you click and drag to select them. So right now I have just been clicking once to select the plate and I move that. Clicking once to select the bowl and I move that. But what happens if I click and drag and select everything and then move it? I get this. What's happening? Why is everything stretching? And if ever you've selected like a whole bunch of controls on a rig and then tried to move them, you've probably noticed this kind of thing where the rig just kind of explodes. What's happening? Well, we're getting what's called double transformations. And that is essentially Maya moving things multiple times when it really shouldn't. It's trying to be helpful, but it's not getting it quite right. And this is not Maya's fault. It's just the element of a hierarchy. So what's happening here is because I've selected everything and then I move it. Let's just take the red ball, for example. I have the red ball selected. So I move this and it moves the red ball. Great. And then Maya goes, oh, you have the bowl selected as well. Let's move that too. And oh, wait, the red ball is within the bowl hierarchy. I'll move that for you as well. Keep them connected. So now the red ball has moved twice, one because of me, one because it's attached to the bowl. And then Maya goes, oh, you're also moving the plate? Let me move that for you. And then, oh, wait, the bowl is attached to the plate. Let me move that too, because you've got this hierarchy. And oh, wait, the red ball is still attached to that. Let's move that again. So now the bowl has moved twice and the red ball has moved 3 times. So this is what's giving you that double transformation. So when you're dealing with parenting, you have to be very careful how you select things. Otherwise, you can very easily break the relationship between them. It's not really breaking it, but it's like pushing things in ways we don't want to have happen. So we have to be very careful with that. The second most important thing that parenting lacks is there is no way to turn it on or off. So let's say this green ball here falls off the plate, lands on the table. It's still going to follow no matter what. There's no way to turn it off. The only way to turn it off is to make it so that it never was parented in the beginning. So I take this and just take it out of the hierarchy completely. So it's just like real life. One day, if you have kids, you can't just wake up one morning and go, you know what? Today's the bachelor life day. No more kids today. I'm a bachelor again. Get out of my house, little people. I am free once more. You can't do that. Well, you can, but you're going to be a bad parent if you do that. No, if you've got kids, you're a parent for life. You can't just switch it on or off whenever you feel like it. So we cannot turn parenting on or off. As animators, that's very hard for us because we want our characters to pick up objects, put them down, interact with them, switch to different hands, things like that. With this setup, we cannot do that. So, what do we do? How do we get around this? Well, this is where constraining comes in. So, once again, constraining. How does this work? Let's do this whole setup here. I undid everything here. And oops, not quite there. Yeah, there we go. So everything's back to its default. Let's connect things now with constraints. Now, once again, constraints, the way they work is you go into the constraint menu and there's a whole bunch here. We're going to go over all of them right there in a little bit, but we're going to focus on parent constraining right now because parent constraining connects things very, very nicely and very efficiently. So when you're doing a constraint, you want to select things in the inverse order. You select the leader first, then the follower. So we're going to select the leader, in this case the plate, then the bowl here. And then I'm going to go to constrain, parent. Now when you're doing constraints, it's also very important to open up the options to make sure those are set correctly. So I'm going to open up the options here. And the main thing I want to make sure is that maintain offset is on or off depending on what I need. If you turn this off, the objects will snap together. So if I hit apply here, you'll see that the bowl snapped down to match the position of the plate. It snaps objects together. In most cases, we want to have this maintain the difference in position. So maintain offset, I want this on. The second important thing is which axes are being constrained. In this case, I'm just going to keep it set to all, and then I'm going to show this a little later, how we can use this to our advantage. So I'm just going to make sure all my translates and rotates are constrained, and I'm going to hit add here. There we go. Now we can see that there's a constraint node right there on the bowl. And if I test this super quick, it follows. Yay! So let's keep doing this. Once again, select the leader, then the object that follows, so plate, then the green ball, parent constraint, bowl, then the red ball, parent constraint. So same order that I did before. And everything follows. And you can see that we don't have a hierarchy now. Each object has its own individual constraint that got added to it. Okay, so what has this given us? Well, everything follows. Nice. If I click and drag to select, no double transformations. Nice. That's very handy, especially if you're trying to select complex controls that are all overlapping each other. This can make your job a whole lot easier and you're not breaking something every single time. Very nice. We can turn this on or off. I'm going to go over more of the details of how you animate these as you go. But if we take this off here, I can just adjust the weight attribute on the constraint. So here's our constraint node right here. If I set this, so this is the constraint to the plate, what it's following the plate, and the weight of the attribute, so the strength of it. If I set this to 0, that ball stays behind. If I set this to 1, it follows along. There you go. You can turn it on or off, and if you key that, you can have a character pick up an object and put it down. Perfect. Wow, constraints are amazing. So far we've got all the positives and none of the negatives of parenting. Why would we ever use parenting? For one very specific reason. Constraining is a constraint. Literally a lock. It is constraining it, holding it in place, not allowing it to move. If I try to animate any object that is constrained, so I'll just move the ball here, and I move the plate, snap back. If I try to move any of these objects anywhere else, they snap right back. I cannot animate these. They are literally locked. So even though there's a ton of positives to a constraint, that one negative as an animator, it's just shooting ourselves in the foot. Imagine I'm holding a pen in my hand like I am here. If this was constrained, it would be like it was super glued to my hand, to whatever point I constrained it to. So now no matter what, that pen is just going to be stuck there no matter how I move my hand, and it's just glued. I can't do any of this where I'm moving the pen in my fingers. That is going to be a nightmare. So, what do we do? How do we get the best of both worlds with this? Well, we need to do a more complex constraint setup through there. Now, before we go into that, I do want to go over the different types of constraints and kind of show how constraints work a little bit more in depth. And then I'm going to show how we can combine parenting and constraining to get the best of both worlds without any of the negatives. So, let's show just a few of the different constraints here. I'm going to create a new scene once again, and I'm just going to create a polygon. Let's do a cube once more, and then create a polygon cone. There we go. Okay, so the different types of constraints we have here, the main ones as animators that we will tend to use are the ones in this top section here. Parent, point, orient, scale, and aim constraints. And really, they do what their name says. So a parent constraint, as we saw, it connects the translates and rotates of an object and connects it to the parent object or the lead object. So once again, select your leader first, then your follower. I'm going to do a parent constraint. And now as I translate it, it moves along. If I rotate it, it moves along and it follows like parenting would. So if I duplicate these, let's undo this, duplicate, move them up. And these two I'm going to parent. So child, then parent, hit P. And then this one, leader, then follower, parent constraint. You'll notice that as I rotate them, they move in exactly the same way. They react the same way. This is why it's called a parent constraint. It's mimicking that same relationship. So we've got that. Now, let's delete this constraint here. What is a point constraint? A point constraint only constrains, let's make sure maintain offset is turned on. It only constrains the translations, which means I can translate this. They stay in relation to each other. But if I rotate it, nothing happens. It just stays still. So all of a sudden we have a lot of options here of how constraints can interact with each other, which is really cool. One of my favorite ones here, the orient constraint. So this just constrains the rotations, like that. So orient. Now they're matching the same angle, but they can be positioned differently wherever they go. Now, why is this one of my favorites? This is a very common constraint when you're rigging eyes. If you need eyes to move together, you don't want them to rotate like this, where one eye moves and then the other one like pops out of the socket to rotate along with it. All you want is their rotations to match. So a parent constraint, or an orient constraint like this can make it very easy to have two objects kind of just follow along. In animation, I will say I don't use it very often at all. So from there, we go to a scale constraint. Pretty self-explanatory. Now, the scales are going to be constrained together. There we go. Let me just zero this out here. From there, we have an aim constraint. An aim constraint is a little bit confusing when you first use it. So again, leader, follower, and I'm going to hit aim. And you're going to notice, let's make sure I keep maintain offset on here. You'll notice that the rotations are constrained once more. Well, isn't that what an orient constraint did? What's the difference? The difference is now if I rotate this, nothing happens. Instead, what it's doing is it's locking the rotations of this object to continue pointing to the lead object no matter what. And this is really cool, because if ever I need to animate a spotlight following a character, or like a security camera following a character through a hallway, there we go. It's going to follow them perfectly. Done, easy. I don't have to try and manually adjust anything. So those are pretty darn cool. At least in an animation standpoint. So those would be the main animation constraints, the typical ones that you might use. Honestly, though, parent constraints are what you're going to use like 99% of the time. The others, very, very rarely in comparison. Now, from there, we get into the stranger constraints. So we have a pole vector constraint. A pole vector constraint is specifically for IK limbs. So if you've ever used an IK limb, you're going to have your IK control, and there's a pole vector coming out from the elbow or the knee. It is connected using a pole vector constraint. That is what allows us to have that pole vector that allows us to then twist the IK limb. So that's what it's for. Now we go into Rivet. I'm actually going to skip this just for now and come back to it in just a second. Motion path. Motion path essentially allows us to create a curve for our objects to follow. So if I create a curve here, something like that, I can constrain an object to that curve. So attach to motion path right here, attach. Now it just follows along. There we go. Now I can animate this object on a path. And if I adjust the path here, the object follows along, which is really nice. There we go. Whee! There you go. That's a pretty useful constraint. Once again, not something that you're going to use every day, but there are certain cases, especially if you're animating like a roller coaster that has to follow along a track. Well, this is going to make it a lot easier. From there, we have closest point, point on poly, geometry, normal, and tangent. These are all geometry type constraints. So what I mean by that is they connect to elements of the geometry. And as animators, we barely ever use geometry, normal, and tangent, or even closest point. Those, I've never seen a situation where I've ever had to use any of them. So we don't really have to worry about that. Those are more for rigging setups there. But the important one for us is the point on poly, especially if you have an older version of Maya, 22 or below. So what does a point on poly constraint do? Essentially, what it does is it allows you to constrain something to an actual vertice on your character. Well, why is this helpful? Well, let's bring in a character here, just as a demonstration. So open up character, So the reason a point on poly is helpful is that there will be times when you are trying to constrain something to a rig, and this goes to that pen comment earlier. You need to constrain something to a rig, but it's nowhere near any main control. So let's say I have to put a pen or a pin or a metal right here on the character. How do I do that? Let's turn off, or make sure I can select the body here. There we go. And I'm going to use this right there. If I constrain this to the shoulder, that's not going to quite work, because as I rotate this, you can see that the body here isn't really changing that much. So if I did a parent constraint there, that's not right. Okay, well, maybe I'll constrain it to the chest control here. Parent constraint. Now as the arm moves, okay, that seems okay. But if I move the clavicle, oh, that's definitely not right. Now it's just cutting through the body. It's not staying in place there. So instead, what we would want to do is a point on poly. So you can take a vertice here, select your object, point on poly right there. And now, as I move the object, it stays perfectly on that point right there, like so. So that is how you would connect an object like a pen or something into someone's pocket. Now, why is that helpful? Well, one is going to move along with, but what's even more helpful is the rivet constraint, which is very similar, but it gives you an extra step that you don't have to do manually. So what a rivet constraint does is, instead of connecting an object directly to the vertice, if I select the vertice here and then hit rivet, it creates a locator on that vertice that I can then use to constrain and parent things together. And the reason this is important is going to be explained in a little bit here. But it essentially gives us an extra buffer, an extra element that we can use instead of always having to select a vertice. And that locator is attached to the vertice, so it's just going to follow along. So point on poly and rivet are very similar. Rivet just gives you that extra step, which you could do manually just by constraining with point on poly a locator to the vertice. So it really just skips a step. So those are the main different types of constraints. Again, do you need to know all of these? No. The biggest one that you really need to focus on is the parent constraint. That's going to be your best friend through most animations ever. So with all of that, what kind of constraint setup do we want to use? So let's go into a quick scene here. Let's see. Here we go. So let's say we've got a simple scene here. We've got a hand and a box, and we need to constrain this box to follow the hand right there. We need to have this follow along. Well, we've got two options here at default. We can either parent it or we can constrain it. Now, if this character has to pick up the box and put it back down, already we know that parenting isn't going to work. It's just going to break things. Additionally, if this box is rigged in any way, like I just did here, we cannot use parenting directly, because parenting is again hierarchy based, and this box has a hierarchy, which means that if I try to parent it, it's going to tear apart the hierarchy of the rigged box and break the rig. So we can never use parenting directly with a rig, parenting part of a rig to something else. We just cannot. It's going to break things. So already parenting is out the window. We want this to be picked up and then dropped. It's not going to work. Okay, constraining. We'll do constraining then. But we want to animate this. How do we do it? How do we get the best of both worlds? Well, what we need to do here is create a simple setup that allows us to have essentially a buffer between the two. So let me actually just show this here. So we have the hand and the box right there. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a locator right in the middle here. I'm going to call it my anim locator. And then what we're going to do is we're going to constrain the box to the locator. and parent the locator to the hand. So that way, because it's a parent, the hand, as it moves, it's going to drag the locator around, and then the locator is going to move the box for me. Now, why do we have this? How does it help? Well, let's just go in Maya and see what happens. So I'm going to create my locator right here, move it up right there. I'm just going to call this anim loc for locator. Okay, so I'm going to leave this separate here. Usually I'll lay them out in a way that makes a little bit more sense. But once again, what we're going to do here is we're going to constrain the box to the locator. So locator, then box, leader, then follower, constrain, parent, right there. Now the box follows the locator. Easy. Okay, now I'm going to take my locator and I'm going to parent it to the hand. When you're parenting things to hands or when you're constraining things to hands, you always want to constrain it to the arm control of the hand, not the wrist control. So in this case, on this rig, it's this little ball at the end of the rig there. So I'm going to select the child, then the parent, and hit P, like so. So once again, what does that give us? Well, if I move the wrist moves the locator. And then because the box is constrained to the locator, it moves that as well. Okay, well, that I could have just done one constraint. Yes, but because this is parented, the locator itself is a child, which means that the child has free reign. It can move around and do whatever it wants. It can follow the parent. Now I can move this and place this wherever I need and animate the box into the hand, in this case, if I wanted to. And now, there we go, following along. I can have this move wherever I want. I can animate this, and it's constrained. Okay, I need to turn this off. Well, to turn off a constraint, once again, you can either come in here and there's our anim locator constraint. I can turn the weight off right there, and that will turn off our constraint. And I can turn that off, no longer following. Yay! There's an easier way though. If you want to globally turn off a constraint, especially as you're animating, the easier way to do this is to select your object that's constrained. You'll see the attributes are blue here. Hit S to set a key. And what you're going to get is green attributes now. This shows that they are constrained and keyed. And you're going to have a blend attribute. So this is a blend parent because it's a parent constraint. And this is a global on-off switch for any constraints in your scene. So now it's 0, it's off, not following along. If I need to turn this on, boop, there we go. Now it's following through there, done. So with this, I now have a very simple constraint setup that allows me to turn it on and off, allows me to animate it, and doesn't break any hierarchies or anything like that. Nice and easy. And this is typically what I call the simple constraint setup. It is constraints at their most basic. Very rarely do you ever just do a straight constraint in animation. If you do, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. Typically, you want some sort of buffer. I like locators, but honestly, it could be anything. It could be another object, it could be a group, whatever. Now, let's see, there's a question here. Can we unlink the item that's constrained to the point on poly? Yeah, just like any other constraint, you can turn that on and off. So as the character pulls out the pen, you would just blend that attribute on or off. There you go. So from there, this is the simple constraint setup, but it's not always ideal. The main area that's kind of not ideal about this simple constraint setup is that if ever I have to adjust a pivot point on something or give myself a little bit of extra control, I don't have it. So for example, here, I've got my locator positioned right there. Let's actually make sure my constraint is turned on. It's over here. This is how I'm animating the box. But if I want this in the hand right there, let's say, and I want the box to pivot from the palm of the hand, so it's doing this kind of thing, versus just rotating from way out here, I can't. You're basically stuck with however you connected these objects together, which is a pain because if I'm doing something like this, look at how the pivot point of the pen is changing. So let me go full screen here. The pivot point is rotating from the end. Now it's rotating from the middle. Now it's rotating from the other end, right here. See that? The pivot point is no longer over here, it's over here. There's a lot of times when you're selecting objects and you're holding them that the pivot point will change. So for example, I could hold my water bottle. I'm turning into Maya in real life. I can hold my water bottle here and I'm holding it from the base right there. Or I can let it slip and hold it here. Or I can hold it from the handle here. That changes the pivot point as I'm holding it. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could do that in Maya and have that ability to adjust where characters are holding that? Well, after the simple constraint, and for anyone who's just starting with constraints, this is what I would recommend just using to start with, a simple constraint. It's going to help avoid just kind of messing with your brain. But once you've got that, once you've understood how this works, we can go one step further. So now we're going to go into the offset constraint. So the offset constraint is using two locators. And essentially what we're doing is very similar. The only thing we're adding is what's called an offset locator. You can call it whatever you want. But you can see that we are doing the same thing, constraining the box to a locator. We're parenting the anim locator to the hand, but now we have an extra parent here between the offset and the anim locator. Okay, why? Why are we doing this? What's the point of all this? Well, let's see. So let me undo this, undo. There we go. Now I should actually show, if ever you want to delete a constraint, so this object is constrained right now, all you need to do is open up the hierarchy. There you go. That's the word I'm looking for. Right there. And you'll see the constraint node. Just delete that. Now it's no longer constrained. So once again, the setup we need here is we have our anim locator. I'm going to duplicate that. And now we're going to have our offset locator. Cool. So we've got two locators here. Let's set this up. Once again, box is constrained to the offset locator this time. So I'm going to select the leader, then the follower, constrain parent. Then we're going to select the child, then the parent. So the offset gets parented under the anim locator, and then the anim locator gets parented under the wrist right there. So if I double check that this works, yep, same thing. Everything works, except now we've got this extra layer. Why? What's the point of this extra locator? Well, this is our offset and essentially allows us to change the pivot point. So here is our anim locator, where we would typically be animating. Let's say I want the box to pivot from this corner right here. Well, all I need to do is move my offset locator like so that it is positioned right here, like so. And now the box is rotating from that corner. Done. Let's say I need to rotate from the very center of this face here. Once again, take my offset locator right there, select that, rotating from the very back of that face there. I now have the ability to adjust and manually change at any point the pivot point of this box as it's being held. So I can now just move all of this into the palm of his hand. And now, if I need to make any small adjustments, it's rotating from the back and not some random point that I cannot change. So with this, I just have much more control over exact positioning, which is huge. Constraints are like locks. So if I can make a setup that I can now adjust that positioning without having to remake the constraints or going into the attribute editor and trying to update numbers and anything, that is huge. And do you key the pivot point control? Yes. So you would animate this And essentially it's almost like an FK-IK switch for the most part. Whenever you want to switch the pivot point, you'd change that position and then repose the object into the hand in the correct place. Just like an FK-IK switch. There are other times where you could slide it, especially if I'm kind of sliding the pen through my hand. I could just animate that sliding through. But in most cases, like if I'm grabbing it here and then like that, and now it's rotating from here versus here, I would just animate that pivot point like an FK-IK snap. So you can just animate that and you're good. You've got a pivot point that you can animate and move through, and no matter how you connect your objects, you can always adjust them, which is huge. Very, very helpful. So a good example here is, let's say I want this box to pivot on his finger. He's going to do like a basketball spin, the corner of the box on his finger. If I didn't have this offset control, I would need to take this box here. Let's rotate it. Put this corner on the hand. And okay, let's rotate it now. Rotate. Oh, shoot. Got to put that position back in place. Oh, I got to stand up. Oh, dang it. Moved off again. Already, I moved it twice and it's going to be a nightmare. Or I use my offset control. Put this into the corner here. Like so. And then I can just switch to world mode and actually make sure this is in the corner. This is why you have to look in 3D space. Look at all your axes. There we go. That's got in the corner. Put this on the finger. Like so. There we go. Nice quick spin. Done. Very little work. So now I can easily just have the character holding the box. He pops it up onto his finger and he spins it. And I can just animate that pivot point at any point. So with that, there is another setup. And this is my favorite setup. So far, we've kind of just been building in complexity. And at this point, we are at the offset constraint, which is very nice. Ideally, this is what I would recommend everyone work up to if you're dealing with constraints. It's still a pretty simple constraint, but it gives you that extra power. Now, is it important? This is a good question. Is it important where the locators are in relation to the object? Not necessarily. For me, typically, I try to get the pivot point as close to where I want the object to pivot from to start with. But honestly, it doesn't really matter. So for example, this anim control, it could be anywhere. As long as I use my offset to reposition this, I'm good. The biggest thing to me is trying to line it up with the hand or whichever object is holding it so that I don't have a weird offset in my rotations. So for example, if the hand is straight up here, but then my locator was created and positioned like this to start with, it means that all my rotations are going to be kind of a pain to line up with the hand, if that makes sense. My hand is rotating in these directions here, but then this is kind of rotating at this odd angle. So when I first create my locators and position them, I will try to match them to the hand controls and then to the prop controls individually. That way I can have that connection properly between them and they all line up to each other. And then also is it important that none of the things being constrained or parented have keyframes? When I did it, I had keyframes from the initial position of the object controllers. No, so you can constrain it even if it does have keys to begin with. So let's take this box here, for example. Let's set some keys. And I'm actually going to animate it too. So it's going up through here and then goes down there. So now we've got this box going up and down. If I make that constraint, so select the locator and then the box, constrain parent, all it does is add that blend parent right away. Your keys are still in place, they still exist, but now the object follows the hand. If I was to turn off the blend parent, our animation's still there. So the only important thing, if you've already got things keyed, is that you want to go to the frame that you're going to pick the object up. So if your character grabs this pen here and his fingers touch there on frame 10, let's say, go to frame 10 and that's when you set up your constraints. if you set up your constraints here and then try to get matched, well, they're going to be turned on and aligned to this initial position, not this one. So you want to go to the position where the constraint should turn on. That's when you create the constraint. It's just going to simplify things a lot later down. But if you have keys already, no worries. So once again, this is the offset system, and this system works great. The simple system is nice. It'll get you a good constraint that is versatile and useful, but this system gives you something that you can animate and that will simplify future animations for you. Okay, now there's another version that I like even more than this, and I typically call this the universal system. And it's got 3 locators. So you can see a pattern here. We're just adding more locators. Okay, so why? What's going on here? Well, you'll notice that the first half here is the same. And I like this song. So we've got the box constrained to the offset, offset parented to the anim. Cool, same thing. But now we've got a hierarchy locator, and it's constrained to the wrist. Now we've got 2 constraints, 1 on each end. What the heck? Why? What's the point? This is here because it helps you organize things for 1, and 2, it helps you switch objects much easier. So let's just go back to the offset locator and just kind of imagine a scenario. So we've got all these locators and they are parented underneath the hand control. So you would have your hand here in the outliner, and then underneath that you would have the anim locator and then the offset locator. If we go into my scene, if I didn't undo too far, you can see that right here. So the locator here, when I select it, it's within the rig's hierarchy right there. Now, for a simple rig, that's not a problem. But a complex rig, imagine I have to try and find this locator in the outliner. Just for some reason, I need to select it to make a change. Okay, let's dig in. Well, not there, not there, not there, not there, not there. If you hold down Shift and click the plus, it'll just direct you right to where you need to go. There it is. Look at all the levels we had to dig through just to find that locator. Imagine you've got lots of locators in your scene connected to your character. How do you find them all? It's going to be a pain. It's going to be a nightmare. I'm not a fan of that personally. I hate having to dig through rigs and hierarchies just to find one simple object. So by using the universal method, because we have a constraint here, you'll have your hand right there, and then the hierarchy is going to stay separate. So you're going to have your hierarchy locator, anim, and offset because it's a constraint. It is not connected together. Instead, they just get a constraint node right there. So it keeps everything separate. But now let's imagine another scenario where we have this setup here. The object is parented to this hand here, but now we have another hand or something that needs to grab the box from the first character. What do we do? Well, we could do a whole nother setup where you have 2 more locators here, constrain, parent, and then parent to that, and you'd switch your constraints right there from one to the other on the box. Well, that could work, but then let's say we have a third hand that then passes the box. They're playing hot potato and passing this object from one person to the next, to the next, to the next. Suddenly, you've got to have locators all over the place, connected to all of these hands. And it's messy all over the place. Because once again, we cannot turn a parent on or off. It's always on. So this hierarchy right here is stuck to this hand. So we suddenly have a lot of work if we just need to make a quick switch. Okay. So Erase, 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 erase. And there we go. So with the universal method, because we are constraining it here at the end, what this means is that if we had a robot hand, let's say, right here, that has to then grab the box, all we need to do is take this hierarchy locator and constrain it to the robot hand and switch that constraint there, which I'll show you guys how to do in a little bit here. And suddenly, the entire hierarchy here stays the same, and we can just pass it to another hand. Done. We could have another hand over here. Terrible hands. Right there, and then another one over here. And instead of having to recreate this whole hierarchy setup for every single one, we just constrain that here and here and switch between the constraints, and all your pivot points and everything stay together. Done. So not only does it keep your notes or your outliner organized, but it makes it easy to switch from one hand to the next, to the next, to the next. So once again, how do we set this up? So let me just clean this up here. There we go. So to set this up, let me first find this and unparent it from the rig. So one way to unparent things is just middle mouse drag them and drop them outside of the hierarchy. So right there, boop, like so. So now this is totally separate. And I'm just gonna reset the whole thing. So let's get rid of that, delete our constraint. There we go. So our scene has kind of been reset back to its default right there. So let's make our new locator. Just duplicate this, and I'm just gonna call this higher locator for hierarchy. Okay, so once again, how do we adjust all of this? So the box is gonna be constrained to the locator. So locator first, then box, constrain parent. Now we're going to parent the offset to the animation locator, hit P, so child then parent. We're going to take our animation locator, put that into our hierarchy locator. Essentially, it's just a container to hold all of this in. Hit P. So now you can see there's our hierarchy. And then I'm going to take this and constrain it to the hand. So select your leader first, the hand, then the locator, constrain parent, like so. Now, if we look at our outliner, you can see here's our box right there. Here's our rig right there. And here's all our locators right there, easy to find and easy to adjust within the outliner right there. So that is the first thing that I love about it. I hate digging through rigs and trying to find something in there. Now, how is this going to work? Well, essentially the hierarchy locator is locked. It's not moving at all because it's constrained. Essentially we've created, now we can forget about it. Everything else works exactly the same. So if I move this wrist here, for example, you'll see everything moves. I can take my anim locator, move this around, use my offset to reposition that pivot point wherever I need it to be, like so. And I'm just doing the exact same thing as before. Now I can put that in the palm right there, and it all follows. The only difference is we have this one locator that's sitting there that is essentially just containing everything for us and allows us to very quickly and easily just organize things in our scene. But then above that, beyond that, we can now constrain it to something else. So I'm just going to create a sphere here. And let's say this magnetic sphere is going to come up and pick up the box. Okay. How do we do that? Well, we've got our hierarchy locator there. All I need to do is constrain it to the sphere. So if I select my sphere, then this locator, constrain parent, look what happened to the parent node right here, or sorry, the constraint node. So this is the constraint on this locator. It is now following two objects. It is following the hand and it's following the sphere. Now, what that means is if I move the hand, you can see that this follows along. If I move the sphere, it follows along. and is blending between both of them. So the way I can animate this and switch is if I select that constraint, all I need to do is change the weights. Which one is it following and by how much? If I want it to follow only the hand, I turn off the weight for the sphere. Now it's going to follow the wrist. Perfect. Sphere doesn't do a thing. But if I now switch it, let's say the magnetic sphere has to take it out of his hand, all I have to do is animate this, just like an FK IK switch over one frame. Book, it picks it up. I switch this, key them. Now, whee, it goes off, and I've still got all my pivot points and ability to animate this super nice and easy. Now I can rotate it from that point right here. And everything moves along, and now the hand is free. So by using this method, I'm organizing things cleanly, and I'm giving myself even more power to animate things without having to redo complex setups and having like multiple different constraints, all just working for one simple switch. So this is by far my favorite way of constraining things together. It's a little hard to wrap your brain around at first, but it's going to give you a ton of control in there. Now, those are the basic constraint setups. There is a question here that kind of relates to this. We have just done a very complex constraint setup. So we've got a bunch of constraints in here. Let's say we need to animate them. We need to switch them animating on and off. So if you're going to have a character pick up the box, for example, I need to key my blend parent. So let's actually do this very simply here. So the arm is going to be the thing that holds onto this first, so we can see that's following, but I don't want it to happen right away. So let's actually key this here. I'm going to break this wrist, and I'm just going to animate this going across like that. So we don't want this box to be moved just yet. So I'm going to take my locator here, and I could either do that or take the box. Let's actually take the box here, key that, turn off the blend parent at the beginning. I'm just going to reset its rotations and translations right here. Okay, so we've got that. You can see it's not following along, and let's just get rid of any other animation we have on this box just to simplify this. Okay, so key that first frame, it's good. And actually I do have a, oh, I didn't delete all my keys, that's why. That would explain it. So delete, there we go. So you've got the wrist moving, fine. And then let's actually animate the sphere moving the other way, like so. Okay, so we've got our two objects moving. Now, let's say at frame 5, I need the hand to pick up the box. What I need to do here is just set a key on frame 4. The box is fine where it is. On frame 5, I set another key, turn the blend parent on to 1. Now you'll notice that it reset its position here. Why? Well, the values changed right there. So if I want that to hold its position, what I need to do is make sure that I have all of these rotations and everything keyed on this frame. So let me key that again, double check. Okay, everything's keyed this time. Now if I turn blend parent on, oh, reset again. All I need to do is copy that frame over. Oh, and for some reason it's just, oh wait, yeah, duh. That's why I need to reset this. Blanked out there. So here, this is going to be fine. I'll show you how to properly animate this in just a second. This is very thrown together at this point. But you can see now it's following the hand. Perfect. We've got that turned on, following a hand. There we go. Now we need to have it follow the sphere at some point. So let's say from frame 11 to 12, or actually right here where it touches the sphere, we need that to then follow along. So what I'm going to need to do here is take this locator right there, and I need to adjust my weights right here. So I can right click, key these. I'm not turning the constraint on and off. I am switching it from one object to another. That's why I'm keying these attributes right there. So we've got that. So on frame 13, I'm going to switch this. I'm no longer going to follow the hand, and instead I'm going to follow the sphere, like so. And then I can just reposition this right here. This is where making sure your pivot points are in good positions would be very good. But now we can get this, and I forgot to set a key. Always key your things. It helps a lot. So key and key. There we go. There we go. So now it goes through and then picks up from the sphere. So we get all of this. So from there, we can now have it switch from one object to another. Great. Is this beautiful? No, it is horribly messy. I wouldn't animate this like this. I'm actually going to give you a proper animation demo in just a second here. This is super rough. The whole point of showing this is to answer a question here. How do you retime the whole animation with constraints? And this is very important to keep in mind. When you're animating constraints, specifically when you're animating these attributes right here within the constraint node itself, these are separate from your actual animation keys. So you can see right here, I've got a key on 12 and 13 right here. Okay, cool. Let's click and drag to select everything. So select everything right there. And if we go through this, we have our keys here on this object on 12 and 13 right there. But if I select everything else, notice how there's no keys on 12 and 13 for the constraint. The constraint should be on this object right here, but there's no keys. I can see that they're red there, but no keys. What does this mean? Well, it means that if I retimed this right now, I'm not going to move that constraint and everything's going to break. All your timing is going to get messed up horribly. So why is it not showing up there? Well, when we are clicking and dragging like so to select objects, you are selecting the individual objects. You are not selecting the nodes underneath those objects, which is right here. This is the parent constraint node there, right here. But I'm not selecting that. Maya is just showing it to me as a shortcut. To actually select it, I need to click on the constraint there. So now, if I want to retime it, I need to also control click, boop, like that. Now I can retime everything. That is a pain. That sucks. Especially if you've got a ton of constraints in your scene. Having to dig through your hierarchies and everything to find all your different constraints is mind-numbing. I've had scenes where I've had like 10 plus constraints that are all turning on and off all at the same time and like offsets and whatnot. If you have to try and find them all, especially if they're down into a rig, you're going to be spending so much time just control clicking so many things. Not fun. So there is a way to simplify this. And that is these constraints, even though when you create them, they get placed into the hierarchy of the object that they're following, they don't have to stay there. So for example, I've got a constraint here on my locators. I've got a constraint here on my box. I can just take both constraints right there in the outliner and then group them. So I'm going to hit Control G. So now they are both contained in this group right here. And I can just call this constraints. There we go. Now, if ever I'm retiming my scene, I can just select everything, make sure I click and on all my constraints, which are all contained in one group. Done. I can retime things all good. So you can move these around. It doesn't break anything in your animation. Everything is still exactly how I had it, but now you got everything organized. The only negative to it is now when I click on my box or on my locator here, you'll notice that I'm not getting that shape node in there anymore. I now have to click in here to find them. So you kind of have to make sure you name things correctly here so you know which one is which. So if I want to adjust these keys, I actually have to select it here. That's kind of a pain. But if you've got like 20, or 20 is maybe a little much, but like 10 plus locators, which I have had, this is way more easy to find and way easier to avoid any weird offsets just by organizing them like that. So that's pretty much the constraint system. Now, again, we went like off the rails here and animating this and whatnot. This was not supposed to be an animation demo here because, as you can see, it kind of fell apart. But the goal of this is to just try to think of how you can make a constraint system that works for you. Once again, my preference is the universal system, like this, because it allows me to easily switch from one rig to another without having to recreate a bunch of hierarchies, and allows for all the animation that I really need for most shots. There are times where I will make an even more complex constraint setup here, but those are for very specific situations. If you don't want to go this far, honestly, a simple constraint system like this, where you just constrain the object to the locator and then that to the hand, you're good. Now, it's also important to note that all of these are reversible. So if you want the box to lead and the hand to follow the box, you would just go the opposite way. So this would be the constraint here, right in there, to the locator, and then you would parent it to the box. And this goes for all the different systems. They go either way. So whether you want the box to follow the hand or the hand to follow the box, you're good. The only thing with the hand is you want to make sure it's in IK mode. So that's the setup right there. So with all of that, let's actually do an actual animation, a proper animation, not this monstrosity that we had here by the end. So let me find this one. So this is a very simple assignment. This is something that if you've ever taken the My Workshop Animation Mentor, one of the assignments that you're going to be doing is a robot arm picking up a can and placing it back down. Now, I did a super basic animation here, just the robot arm turning around and going through to pick up and drop the can. So right there, we've got all of this in place. Cool. So at this point, we just need to constrain the can so it actually follows along. So how would I go about this? Well, the first thing is we actually need to go to the frame where the can is going to be picked up. So let's go in here, probably around frame 41, right there. That's when the can is going to get picked up. So at this point, I'm going to create my constraint setup. Now we could just go with a simple one. We could go with the offset one, or we could go with the universal. Honestly, all of them are good. Let's go for the, let's see. What would people want to see? Just out of curiosity. Simple, offset, or universal. They're all pretty similar. Create a locator to start with. Universal? Okay, we can do that. So the way I would set up the universal constraint is we need our 3 locators. So we've got one. I'm going to duplicate it twice. There we go. Now it's very important to name them. So this is going to be offset. This is going to be our anim locator. And this is going to be our hierarchy locator. Now, the hierarchy locator could also be a group. Honestly, any of these locators, what they are doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a locator. Essentially, it's just another object in the scene. And I like locators because they're very small and easy to move around and easy to manipulate. And they don't take up space or get in the way. So the hierarchy locator honestly does not matter where it goes. It is just there to hold the scene together. So I can just put this off to the side right here. I want it close enough so if I need to do a switch at any point, I want it close and easy to access right there. So that's good there. The anim locator, this is going to be our main pivot point. This is going to be where the can is being held from. So ideally, right from the start, I would like this to be pretty much lined up with the can. So as centered as possible and probably lined up right where the robot arm is holding the can. So like right there, maybe a little bit more in the center, somewhere around there. Okay. And then the offset locator honestly doesn't really matter. For me though, personally, I like to keep the offset locator lined up with the main control of the object because then I know it's kind of like the main, or it's part of just moving that object as a whole. So what I can do here, just to facilitate things, is I'll select the locator, then this control here, go to modify, match transformations, and I'm going to match everything except scale right there. Now that just lines it up. I can do the same thing with my anim locator right there, and then just move it straight up right where that can is being held, right there. So this just lines things up. Do you need to do this? Do you need to get it perfect? No. It just kind of helps later on. So we've got our 3 locators in place here. Let's set this up. So once again, the can is going to be constrained to the offset locator, the lowest level. So I'm going to take the locator, then the can, constrain parent, right there. Then I'm going to parent the offset locator to the anim locator right here, hit P. Then the anim locator to the hierarchy locator, hit P. And then I'm going to constrain this locator to the robot arm. So select the robot arm first, and then the locator, constrain parent. And Lizzie, thank you so much for the sub. Aw, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So at this point, we've got our constraint set up. Done. And to prove it, it all moves together. Yay. So our constraint setup is complete. Perfect. Now we just need to animate it. So at this point, to animate this, I would probably animate the can turning on and off right here, just because it's going to be a little easier. So I can just select my can, hit S on frame 41 to set a key right here where it's about to be picked up, and you'll see that the blend parent goes to 0 and actually turns off the constraint right there. So while it's turned off, I'm going to go to frame 40, hit S to set a key just to make sure everything's lined up, and we can make that switch. And then on 41, where it touches, I'm going to turn this back on, bip, like so. Now we can see the can stays put, gets picked up, gets picked up. There we go. So we've just turned that constraint on. Now we need to turn this off. So to turn this off here, what I can start to do is I can animate this can being pushed down. This is the beauty of this animation. Maybe I can't adjust the robot arm motion at all. I have to leave that as is. Well, the can's cutting through the ground right here. Darn it. What do I do? Well, I can just take my offset locator in this case, and you can see I can move that up and down. Also, if I do have to animate any like swing, I should mention that here, as it swings through, I can just take my anim locator, and now you can see I can rotate that, make sure I don't select both of them here. Select that and just spin that around exactly where that grip is. And then the offset locator allows me to move this up and down and essentially now rotate this from different points. So now it can rotate from here, or if I move this really high up here, now it's rotating it and I can actually have this spin down and bloop, drop down there, and it's still spinning from that grip there. So that's the beauty of all of these locators. And this one here is just there to hold everything in place, so we can forget about that. So now as it comes through and gets pushed onto the ground, I want to make sure that it's actually pressing down onto the ground. So I can take my offset locator here, I'm going to set a key here, and then as it pushes down, I can just slide this up right there, and then frame ahead, slide this up right there. And then by 81, I think this is where I would want this to be kind of released right there. So 80 is good. 81, this is where the can should be pretty much left alone. So at this point, I can set a key on my can here, and let's see right there. So 81 is fine. 80, we want this to still be turned on. And then on 81, let's turn this off like so. So now you'll see that the constraint is off. So we go through, it slides into place and is released right there. Just saw the chat. Now, at this point, I might want to just add a little bit of a slide right here on the can itself, flatten out the rotation there, just kind of have a little bit of residual motion in here. But now I can just animate that manually myself. Maybe a tiny little slide right there, and done. Now it's let go. There we go. So all you need to do is set up your constraints the way you want them, and then just find the keys where you want to turn it on and off, and key it, and then turn the blend parent on and off. The important thing, so that it doesn't snap back. So you notice that the can never snapped back into a previous position. The reason it did that is I keyed everything first on the frame before and after, and then I turned the constraint off. If you can turn the constraint off first, so for example, mid-air here, I'm going to turn off this constraint without setting a key. Boop, it got switched. Because all of the values are not keyed, so it's just going to whatever random position it needs to be in. But if I set a key here first, hit S on everything, then turn it off, it stays in place. You can see it's off right there. And it stayed because I made sure that these new values were saved. So making sure you key something before turning it on or off, very important to avoid any pops or wiggles. But now we've got this, and we get that nice press right there on the ground, super quick and easy. If I want to add any animation to this, I can just take my anim locator here, and let's let it go up here, and then maybe just add a tiny little drag here. That's a little too much right there. Okay, and that comes through, maybe a little bit more. And it comes through here a little bit more. So now we can get that. As it slows down here, we can have this start to swing across before it kind of resets itself here. So something like this. That's super, super rough. But you can see how I can quickly add that. It's pivoting from the right position. I could even have a moment here where as it's going through the air, it could actually be slipping out of the claw's hand. So like by this point here, this could slip down a little bit. So it picked it up from there, but over time it's just like slipping, slipping, slipping. And then let's kind of get it just barely holding on here. It needs to be a little higher. So right there. Oh, and moving the can, not the offset, that's why. I was wondering, something wasn't quite working. There we go, select the right control. So as it starts to swing here, I'm just gonna add a little bit of drag. So it starts here, kind of gets down a little lower right there. As it gets to the end point here, it's gonna be like right down there, barely holding on. Then as it presses down onto the ground, gets pushed back up right there. Like so. So now I can very easily add layers of animation, no problem, because I've got that offset in there and it's still keeping that pivot point where I need it to be. And I can just build this complex animation with very little work. So this is the power of a complex constraint setup. It gives you the ability to quickly animate efficiently without having to hurt your brain trying to figure out, okay, it's held on, but now it's locked and I can't do anything with it. So how do I make it move and all that horror? Yeah, this would be the universal constraint setup. And then once again, if ever you needed it to be picked up by something else, all you need to do is animate the hierarchy constraint and the switch right there, and then another robot arm can take it, and I'm once again not having to redo a whole different hierarchy for every single robot arm that picks up this can. So that's constraints. That's pretty much it. Trying to think if there's anything else I haven't mentioned here. Let's see, went over the different constraints. Oh yeah, there is one other thing that I did want to mention. So once again, just going over constraints themselves. The other powerful thing with constraints is that constraints don't have to be limited to their defaults. So what I mean by this is, let's say we've got two objects here, and I'm going to constrain them, but I only want to constrain it so that as I move the object up and down, that's the only thing that follows. Everything else stays the same. Well, I'll choose my leader, then my follower, constrain point in this case, because I just want the translations. And I'm just going to make sure that it only constrains the y-axis right here. I'm going to hit apply. Okay, now if I move this left and right, nothing happens. In, out, nothing happens. Up, down, now it stays the same. So now I can do something like this, where one object is going in circles and the other one is just following up and down. I could have them connected so that only certain rotations work together. I can connect them so you can mix and match. So for example, let's undo this here. Let's say I want this to, well, I want this to act a little bit more like parenting. So if I do a parent operation here, and then a parent constraint down here, constrain parent, you'll notice that they move very similarly. Great, they all work together. Yay. But something that they don't do is scale the same. See how the parent constraint, the object stays the same size, the one that's following. It doesn't scale with it. Well, with constraints, as long as your constraints are not affecting the same attribute, you can add multiple constraints. So right here, my parent constraint is affecting the translates and the rotates, but nothing is affecting the scales. So if I take this here, and let's undo this so that they're back at their default size here. If I now go into constraint scale, right there, I can add that. And now you'll see I have two constraints, a scale constraint right there and my parent constraint. And now they act pretty much exactly the same. So I can mix and match. They give you a lot of power. Constraints are insanely helpful, especially when you start diving into them. Something I hear quite often is, why learn constraints when you have things like Animbot, where there's just one button and it follows along and you don't have to worry about constraints at all? Well, to start off with, that tool is awesome. It is fantastic. I love that tool. It simplifies so many things. If I have a character just picking something up and dropping it, I don't have to do a complex constraint setup. Just hit a button, done. Yay, I love it. I use it all the time. Knowing constraints doesn't mean that you can't use these awesome tools. But knowing constraints also means that you will have better access to know ways that you can turn complex animations into very simple procedures, where all you have to do is, like when I was holding the can, I could just slide that down, add a rocking back and forth, and I animated it in seconds, versus if you're trying to do that manually, you're going to be spending hours polishing that up because you're going to be translating and rotating, and it's going to be a nightmare of curves. So knowing how to use constraints properly allows you to do complex situations like a pen spin like this, and you can animate it in no time. So I highly recommend everyone learn constraints. Don't have to go super deep into it. Even if the most you get is the simple constraint setup, that's going to get you a long way.